but even that was a big deal. And I'm thinking of that as I try to identify with village women in the Daikandi province of Afghanistan. Do you know in the more remote villages, a woman is allowed to leave her village to go to the market once a year? That's a confinement that I would find extraordinarily difficult. But in this Daikandi province, they had organized a 3-car caravan that would include grandmothers and women and children, and they would not only leave Daikandi, they would go clear to Kandahar, to the marketplace, and then up to Kabul for medical care for those who were going to be part of this convoy. It must have been an extremely exciting event for those involved. And it set forth, and there was no way the passengers in the convoy coming from Daikandi province, a civilian convoy, could know that 12 miles away from a mountainous stretch where they were driving along, a United States airborne vehicle had let 12 paratroopers out who had arrived on the ground. And again, the drone surveillance was responsible to make sure that there wouldn't be any harm done to the 12 U.S. paratroopers. And then along the road, they spotted this unexpected convoy. How could they know? Maybe it was a convoy of anti-government forces or Taliban. And so a kill chain was invoked to try to decide whether or not the United States must declare impact and implode each of the cars of the convoy. And the drone surveillance was occasioning so much electronic feedback as multiple drones were feeding back information, and the drone analysts were all trying separately to analyze the information. And one drone information analyst had figured out there's a grandmother in one of those cars holding a baby, and he was trying mightily to get his information sorted to the top of the deck, but it time-wise didn't work out. A decision had already been made, the word was given, impact, the joystick was pulled, and the first car in the convoy exploded. Women in the second car jumped out and they pulled off their long scarves and they waved them in the air, shouting, "Civilians, civilians!" But the drone can't hear that. The second car was exploded. And then the third car was spared because the one who realized that there were grandmothers and infants had finally gotten his message to the top. The New York Times article describing it said it was like a lost email that shouldn't have been lost. But there were lost lives that shouldn't have been lost. In Chicago, whenever we meet somebody who grew up on a farm and wants to volunteer with us, I usually say, grab that person. Because people who work on farms have a work ethic like nothing I've ever seen. And I've been so edified by and impressed by the Afghan peace volunteers. They're young people who've grown up in the farming areas of the Bamyan province, and they are hard workers. It's nothing to them to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, get on a donkey, even on an icy cold morning, you can see their breath and probably hugging the donkey for warmth, ride for 6 hours to a mountainside where they can scavenge for tumbleweed and twigs, small pieces of wood, fill 2 burlap sacks with as much fuel as they can, because that's how they heat their homes and do cooking. 6 hours back on the donkey, back home, offload the fuel, then go out and harvest or plant potatoes, and then go out to get water and bring it back, and then try by candlelight, because there's no electricity, to study. These are kids who work hard. It's very dangerous to go out to the mountainside, whether you're scavenging for fuel or trying to find scrap metal or maybe hoping you could open up a cluster bomb that's been found and extract the brass and get a big amount of money for your family. But one of the gravest dangers is that in spite of the drone surveillance being so able to pick up minute details of information, we find that again and again and again, the shepherds on the mountainsides, the children on the mountainsides have been shot dead. There was a day in the Kunar province when 8 shepherds were on the mountainside, and one of them, his life was spared. He said that what happened was that a helicopter gunship flew overhead. One of Chinese Combat Brigade unit helicopters, their engine is the same engine used in an Abrams tank. It's the most huge airborne weapon that the United States arsenal has. 2 of these flew over the mountainside. One went way up high. The surviving child saw a bright green flash, and then he said the one that had gone up so high came down, the gun came out, and each one of his companions was shot dead. A tree had cracked, and the branches of that tree protected this young 13-year-old child. His name also was Wahidullah. And so the next day, General Petraeus, who at the time was the head of the International Security Assistance Forces, apologized. He said this tragic event should never have happened. And certainly that was true. It should never have happened. But at Voices, we keep a kind of a macabre list we call the Afghan atrocities list. And it lists every time that civilians, unarmed civilians, have been killed by U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And I'm sad to say that we update it about once a week. So we are living in a time when jobs are controlled by what Dwight Eisenhower warned us about. 3 days before he left office in 1952, he said, beware of unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. And in spite of the fact that we can see again and again that this burgeoning, bloated military is not securing a better life for women and children in Afghanistan, there are 400 new refugees every single day. I was there during much of the past winter. 100 children froze to death. 26 of them across the road from a sprawling U.S. military base where trucks that have spent thousands of dollars paying off warlords so that they can go along the roadways. These trucks are constantly bringing clean water and food and fuel to the United States troops, and people right across the way are suffering. 250 children die of starvation every day in Afghanistan, and yet we are to think that the United States has to be there to protect the women and children. What about the women who are going to the cemeteries carrying the bundles of their children who died? 850 children die every day in Afghanistan. And yet if you go with us over to Kabul, you'll be welcomed. You'll be treated as though you are the grandmother, the aunt, the beloved. I don't know where I got it from, but I have a pretty neurotic fear of edges. I'm in awe of Gandhi, who at the end of his life, when Muslims were killing Hindus and Hindus were killing Muslims, and it all seemed to come apart, he practiced walking on first a sort of a makeshift bridge that was just 4 inches off the ground. And then eventually he was able to walk on bridges that were strung between the treetops so that he could go alone to the villages where the fighting was raging. He went alone into those villages to give the sign that people could stop the fighting, clean up the debris, and sign pledges that they would no longer continue to kill one another. This is how he wanted to try to spend his life in bringing an end to that terrible violence. He went with no armored personnel carriers or tanks or Humvees or Jeeps. He went with a sack slung over his back. And so I think of Gandhi often in that incredible bravery and courage, and I certainly was thinking of him when I was in Bamyan in this very mountainous central highland area, and because of my neurotic fear of edges, I was just trying to cross a creek with the Afghan peace volunteers going in between villages, and there was just a very narrow plank, 1 foot in front of the other, and I froze. I couldn't do it. I just wasn't going to be able to walk across that plank. And finally the kids realized, she's not going anywhere. And one of them jumped into the creek. It was about hip deep, put up his arms and said, "My grandmother, I catch you." And then one was in front of me, and one behind me, and I got across the creek. And I think that's really the way it is. If we let ourselves fall into arms that are outstretched, yearning for a better world, uncuffed, unchained from our own huge arsenal, we'll have so much more resource to dedicate to making a better world. We'll have so much more love for us all around the world. Is it doable? You know, the last time that I was at a demonstration was again in Kansas City, and my very good friends, Brian Terrell, Mark Kenny, and Ron Faust, decided that because the drones were being operated inside of Whiteland Air Force Base, they would just try to carry into the base an enlargement of international law that prohibits the drone warfare. And we anticipated that they would likely be arrested, and they'll likely do 4 to 6 months in prison for that action. But those of us who decided not to protest in that form were close to the base, but we hadn't crossed the line. And out came a contingent of soldiers who were the furthest thing from the ones I described when we planted the corn on the nuclear missile silo sites. They were wearing full battle gear with plastic shields and batons and helmets, and they couldn't hardly be even seen, and they were doing this kind of cha-cha-cha, 1, 2, 3, 4, and banging the batons on the plastic shields to, I guess, express strong intimidation. But truthfully, they didn't look all that intimidating, and I was on the microphone and trying to figure out how to respond to this. I was definitely making it up as I went along. So I said, you know, we need your discipline too. We really need the discipline to learn the languages of people in other countries and to find ways to grow a stronger movement. And I said, so when you count 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm going to practice Yek Do Se Taha. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 in Dari. And so they had to pause, and it was pretty clear they weren't going to clobber us. And I thought about the ending to the book Kite Running. Some of you may have read that novel, and I really recommend it. It took me years to finish it because as soon as I realized one little boy was going to be tortured, I'd set it aside. But I recently finished it and was deeply impressed and saw the film also. And at the end, there's a very beautiful, poignant line that the young Hazara child says to the friend who has betrayed him, even though the betrayal has been so harsh. He says it, it's an Afghan line that's treasured. It means, for you 1,000 times over. And I tried to put that together with Gregorian chant and sang it to these soldiers. For you 1,000 times over. 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 And that's what I heard from people in war zones again and again, whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, Gaza, Nicaragua, Sarajevo, people who mean us no harm but who are directly affected by our weapons and particularly our wars of choice have said for you 1,000 times over. Words of forgiveness, words of hope, words for a future. And so I offer that to you today, loving and blessing the spirit of Clare, the spirit of Francis, the spirit of the good women who brought us together here. Let us say to one another and to our world, for you 1,000 times over, we will do the things that make for peace.